June 13th, 1942, 12:10 in the morning, Amagansett Beach, Long Island, New York. Seaman John Cullen is 21 years old. He is alone on this stretch of sand. He has no weapon, only a flashlight, which is doing almost nothing against the fog rolling in off the Atlantic. This coastline is considered a likely landing point for enemy incursions. The Coast Guard knows it, so does the Navy. And yet on this particular night, on this particular stretch of beach, John Cullen is the only man watching it. He has been in the Coast Guard for 6 months. He has never fired a weapon in anger. He has never seen a German soldier in his life. He is about to see 4 of them. A shape appears out of the fog. Then a voice. "We're fishermen from Southampton. We ran aground." The man who steps forward is middle-aged, speaks good English, seems calm. His name is George John Dasch. He is 39 years old. He has lived in America for years, long enough to know the language, the rhythms of conversation, the things Americans say when they need to sound ordinary. What he cannot account for in this moment is the 2 armed sailors crouched in the dunes directly behind him, waiting for his signal to kill the young Coast Guardsman standing in the fog. Dasch does not give the signal. What he does instead will determine everything. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a fistful of bills. $260, the equivalent of 3 months of Cullen's salary. He pushes the money into the young man's hand. "Forget you saw us," he says, "for your family's sake, for your mother's sake." Then he disappears back into the fog. Cullen stands on the sand for a moment. He looks at the money, he looks at the dark water, then he turns and runs. He doesn't know that the man who gave it to him was already planning to destroy everything he had been sent to build. He just runs. Cullen reached the station and told his commander what he had seen. Within hours, an armed patrol returned to the beach with shovels. What they found was later described in the official report: 4 wooden crates of explosives buried in the wet sand. German Navy uniforms folded beside them, fuses, detonators, and pre-assembled incendiary devices ready for use. The crates were dug up and secured. The FBI was notified. A manhunt was initiated. The problem was that the men who had buried all of it were already on a commuter train heading into Manhattan. The beach gave the FBI everything it needed except the people who had been standing on it. August 8th, 1942. Washington, D.C. 56 days after that night on the beach. 6 men are led into a room at the District of Columbia jail. They are dressed in civilian clothes. They have been tried, convicted, and sentenced. Each of them walks to a chair. The chair is wired. The sentence is carried out 6 times before noon. From the moment German boots touched American sand to the moment the last man died, 56 days. It is one of the fastest executions in American legal history. The FBI director will call it his agency's greatest triumph. Almost nothing he says will be true, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened on that beach, you have to go back not to June 1942, but to September 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor, when 33 Nazi spies operating inside the United States were rounded up and convicted in a single sweep. Their entire network had been built over years. It collapsed because one of their own had been a double agent from the beginning. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, lost everything it had invested in American operations in a matter of days. The reports reached Hitler. He was not philosophical about it. He demanded an immediate response. The officer who had to stand in front of him and deliver one was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr. Canaris was in an almost impossible position. He privately believed Germany would lose the war. He had run enough operations to understand the odds. What he told Hitler was that a new sabotage program targeting American industrial production was feasible, with the right men. What he told his own staff, away from the Führer, was more honest. In any program involving more than a handful of men, he said, someone always talks. He ordered the program to proceed anyway. He knew better than to cross Hitler. He was right about almost everything, including this. The logic behind the operation was not irrational. By 1942, the United States was producing warships, aircraft, tanks, and ammunition at a rate Germany had no answer for. The factories were running. The assembly lines were moving. Every month of undisrupted American production made the Axis position worse. You could not sink the factories with U-boats, you could not bomb Pittsburgh from across the Atlantic. The only option was to put men inside the country and have them attack from within. Not to win the war through sabotage, but to disrupt, delay, and frighten. To force the American public to feel the war at home. To make workers afraid to go to the factory. There was even a precedent for this thinking. In July 1916, German agents had detonated munitions at the Black Tom Island Pier in New Jersey, a loading platform stacked with shells and powder bound for the Allies. The explosion broke windows 25 miles away. 7 people died, $20 million in damage. The Statue of Liberty, less than a mile offshore, sustained structural damage that took decades to assess. One operation. No invasion, no army. Just men with knowledge and access and a plan. That was the model Kappe was working from when he began selecting his agents in early 1942. The idea that a small group of the right people could do what no fleet could accomplish from the ocean. America in the summer of 1942 was not the relaxed, untouchable country it had been a year earlier. Pearl Harbor had changed something fundamental. Air raid drills were being conducted in coastal cities. Blackout curtains were going up in homes along the eastern seaboard. Women were entering factories in numbers that would have been unthinkable in 1940. The war was present in American life in ways it hadn't been before. But the sense of physical safety, the bedrock belief that no enemy force could actually reach the American mainland, was still mostly intact. No bomb had fallen on American soil. No enemy soldier had walked through an American city. The German High Command understood that attacking this sense of safety, even symbolically, had value beyond any specific factory or bridge. Fear, properly introduced, is its own kind of weapon. Lieutenant Walter Kappe of Abwehr II had spent years in America before the war organizing German-American communities for the Nazi Party. He knew the country. More importantly, he knew people, specifically Germans who had lived in America, learned to blend in, and then returned to Germany. He went through his address books carefully. He was looking for men with American accents, American habits, American knowledge. Men who could buy a newspaper and order coffee without anyone looking twice. He found 8. He told them the mission would strike a decisive blow for the fatherland. He did not share Canaris' assessment of the operation's realistic odds. The 8 men Kappe selected all shared the same critical quality. Every one of them had spent years in the United States before the war. Several had held ordinary American jobs, factory workers, waiters, mechanics. 2 had American citizenship. They spoke English without heavy accents. On paper, this made them ideal. In practice, it created a problem Kappe apparently never seriously examined. These were men being asked to destroy a country they had already chosen to live in. The Abwehr had a safeguard for this. The men were told explicitly, if any member of the group showed signs of weakening in his commitment, the others were to kill him without hesitation. This was not a threat. It was standing protocol. Training took several weeks at a farm outside Berlin. The men learned to build and plant explosives, to disable railway systems, to attack power infrastructure, to identify vulnerabilities in American industrial facilities. They were taken on tours of German aluminum plants and railroad yards specifically so they could understand the mechanical logic they would be replicating in American targets. They memorized maps of the Horseshoe Curve Railroad junction in Pennsylvania. They studied the Hellgate Bridge in New York, 4 vital rail arteries crossing in a single span. They practiced with timer mechanisms and fuses. Nothing was written down. When training ended, they were given a farewell banquet in Berlin, American money, false identity documents, and driven to the French coast. 2 submarines, 2 routes, 2 beaches. The first group, Dasch, Ernest Berger, Richard Quirin, and Heinrich Heinck, boarded U-202 at Lorient on the night of May 26, 1942. The crossing took 17 days. On the night of June 12th, U-202 surfaced in shallow water off Amagansett. The men rowed ashore in a rubber raft with their crates of explosives. What nobody had planned for was what happened next. U-202, having deposited its passengers, became stuck in the sand less than 200 meters offshore. The submarine sat there, visible from the beach, until the tide came in at dawn. If anyone had been looking in the right direction, the operation would have been over before the men had buried their first crate. Nobody was looking. The submarine pulled free and vanished back into the Atlantic. The four men took the Long Island Railroad to Manhattan. Dasch's team had specific targets in mind for the New York area, and they were not randomly chosen. Hellgate Bridge was first on the list, a steel arch crossing over the East River in Queens carrying 4 separate rail lines, 2 for passengers, 2 for freight, at the most congested rail junction in the northeastern United States. Taking out Hellgate would have paralyzed passenger and cargo movement across the entire region. Pennsylvania Station was another target, along with its associated rail infrastructure, the Aluminum Company of America plant in East St. Louis. Cryolite processing facilities in Philadelphia, essential for producing the aluminum that American aircraft plants were consuming at increasing rates. The list had been assembled by people who understood the American industrial system. The men carrying it walked into Manhattan and checked into their hotels. By the time investigators arrived at Amagansett with shovels, the 4 men were already in Midtown Manhattan. There was no trail, no witnesses beyond Cullen, no names, no photographs. The FBI knew an enemy landing had occurred. They had the physical evidence to prove it. Crates of military-grade explosives, German Navy uniforms, professional fusing equipment, incendiary devices. A full sabotage kit, professionally assembled. What they did not have was any way to find the men who had left it behind, or that one of those men was already sitting in a hotel room 2 hours away, thinking about coming to them. Dasch was in a Midtown Manhattan hotel room. He had $82,000 in Nazi operational funds. He had a list of targets and a 2-year timeline. He had 3 men depending on him to run the operation as planned, and he was sitting in his room, ordering room service, watching the city from his window, and experiencing what can only be described as a collapse of purpose. He had lived in New York. He had worked here. He knew what these streets were. He had agreed to the mission for reasons that now, standing inside the country he was supposed to destroy, felt remote and abstract. Here is the thing Kappe had never accounted for. You cannot recreate in a training farm outside Berlin the experience of standing on a street corner in Midtown Manhattan at noon on a Tuesday. The sounds, the volume of people, the newspaper vendor on the corner, the same as he had always been, the smell of the city in summer. Dasch had been gone for years, but the city was exactly as he remembered it. This is the detail I keep coming back to when I read accounts of this operation. Not the strategic failure, not the intelligence breakdown, but this. A man standing on a New York street with $82,000 in his coat and the names of 7 other agents in his head, looking at a city he used to live in, and understanding in a way that no briefing room in Berlin could have prepared him for that he could not do what he had been sent to do. If you want to know how an operation designed to run for 2 years ended in 14 days, stay with this. If you're watching on your phone and finding this useful, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep producing these stories. Because what George Dasch decides in the next 48 hours, and what happens because of it, is the strangest part of a story that is already strange. Back to Manhattan. Dasch has the money. He has the names. He has a phone. And Ernest Berger, the man in the room next to his, who spent 18 months in a Nazi concentration camp before this mission, is the only person in the group who knows what Dasch is thinking. Berger's presence in this operation is its own kind of story. He had returned to Germany from America in the 1930s and had been arrested on suspicion of insufficient loyalty to the party. He had spent a year and a half in a concentration camp. He had been released. He had been handed explosives and a submarine ticket to New York. Whatever his reasons for agreeing to the mission, and he may not have felt he had a real choice, he was not a committed Nazi operative. He and Dasch talked. The precise content of those conversations was never fully recorded. What is clear from later testimony is that Berger knew what Dasch was planning and did not try to stop him, which, given the standing order to kill any member who showed signs of weakening, was its own kind of choice. 4 days after the Long Island landing, the second group arrived. U-201 surfaced before dawn on the night of June 16th off Ponte Vedra Beach, south of Jacksonville, Florida. The commander was Edward Curling, 42 years old, formerly a domestic servant in New York, who had chosen this landing site himself based on his knowledge of the area. His 3 companions were Werner Thiel, Herbert Haupt, and Hermann Neubauer. They came ashore in a rubber raft, buried their equipment among the palm trees above the tide line, and walked to the highway. No fog, no encounter, no complication. They caught a Greyhound bus to Jacksonville the next morning. The landing had gone exactly as planned. They did not know that in New York, Dasch was already sitting by his phone. Curling's target list was different from Dasch's, and arguably more strategically significant. His team was assigned the canal locks at Cincinnati and St. Louis, controlling commerce on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. They had instructions for the cryolite plant in Philadelphia, essential for aluminum production. They were to hit the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad and aluminum facilities across the mid-Atlantic states. The logic was sound. 2 teams, geographically separated, striking different sectors simultaneously, would be harder to contain, and would send a clearer message than one concentrated attack. Taken purely as a plan, it had been assembled by people with real knowledge of American infrastructure. What it hadn't accounted for was human nature. Curling split the group. He and Thiel headed for New York and then Chicago. Haupt and Neubauer moved towards Cincinnati to begin reconnaissance on the canal locks. What happened instead was homecoming. Herbert Haupt, 22 years old, American citizen from Chicago, went directly to his parents' house. He had not seen them since before the war. His parents had no idea about the mission. He sat at their dinner table. He slept in his old bedroom. He visited the girlfriend he had left behind. Within days of arriving, he was discussing their future seriously. He began planning a wedding. The 2-year operational timeline his handlers in Berlin had given him was, at this point, not on his mind. Thiel went to New York, where a woman he had known before the war was living. He contacted her. They spent time together. Neubauer reconnected with friends in Chicago. Curling reached his American wife, who was still in the country. These were men who had been selected for their American connections. Now those connections were running the operation. This is not simple cowardice or failure of resolve. This is what happens when you take people who have actually lived somewhere, who have relationships there, who were in some real sense choosing that country before the war intervened, and ask them to destroy it. The Abwehr had built the mission on an assumption about its agents that its agents could not meet. The standing order, kill any wavering agent, existed. Dasch knew it. He also knew that Berger, the man most likely to enforce it, was not going to. And the other 2, Quirin and Heinck, were spending their time gambling and asking no uncomfortable questions, which meant Dasch had something unusual: time and space to decide. He sat in his hotel room for days. He walked around Manhattan. He ate in restaurants. He went to a bar. He later told his interrogators that by the second day in New York, he had already made his decision. He just needed to work out how to do it without getting himself killed in the process. On the evening of June 14th, 36 hours after the encounter on Amagansett Beach, Dasch called the FBI's New York field office. He gave a false name. He said he had recently arrived from Germany. He said he would call FBI headquarters in Washington the following week. The agent who took the call wrote it up and filed it. A notice was sent to Washington. Nobody acted on it. The New York office received hundreds of tips a week from people claiming enemy intelligence. Most were worthless. There was no particular reason to treat this one differently. Dasch waited 5 days. He ordered room service. He looked at the money on the table. He waited. What those 5 days looked like from inside the FBI is instructive. The June 14th call from Pastorius had been logged and routed to Washington as a low-priority contact, one of dozens that week. The Bureau knew from the beach excavation that a landing had occurred. It had physical evidence: German uniforms, military explosives, professional fusing equipment. It was running a manhunt. But it had no names, no photographs, no description beyond what Cullen had provided about a middle-aged man in the fog. The connection between the beach landing and the man who had called the New York office using a German operations code name was not made. The note sat in its file. The 5 days passed. June 19th. Friday morning. FBI headquarters in Washington received a telephone call. The man on the line said he was at a hotel in the capital. He identified himself with the word Pastorius, a reference to his New York call. He said he had $82,000 in German operational funds and a complete account of an active Nazi sabotage operation on American soil. He gave his hotel address. An agent was dispatched within the hour. Dasch was taken into custody, brought to bureau headquarters, and placed in an interrogation room. He reached into a bag and put the money on the table. Then he started talking. He talked for days. The sessions ran into the evenings. He named every agent on both teams. He described the Florida group's composition, their targets, the cities they were heading for. He gave drop points, code phrases, contact protocols. He described the farm outside Berlin, the training methods, the farewell banquet, the submarine crossing, the crates buried on the beach. He described everything he knew about the Abwehr's organizational structure, about Walter Kappe, about the planning process. He answered every question they had. And in doing so, he gave the FBI something they could not have obtained any other way: a complete map of the operation, from Berlin to the American beaches, in a man's own voice. The arrests moved quickly. Berger was taken in New York on June 20th. Quirin and Heinck the same day at their Manhattan hotel. In Chicago, Haupt was arrested at his parents' house, the same house he had visited openly under his own name to see his family. There was no surveillance. There was no manhunt. There was Dasch's testimony and a list of addresses. Thiel was picked up in New York. Curling was found days later. Neubauer was arrested in Chicago. By June 27th, 14 days after U-202 surfaced off Amagansett, all 8 men were in federal custody. Not one had assembled a single explosive device. Not one target had been approached. The operation, designed to run for 2 years, had spent 2 weeks in America, visiting family and spending money. The equipment the Florida team had buried on Ponte Vedra Beach was recovered after Curling identified the location during interrogation. FBI agents dug up the sand among the palm trees and found exactly what their Long Island counterparts had found: crates of explosives, uniforms, fusing materials, operational money. Neither cache had been disturbed. Neither had been touched by its owners since the night they were buried. The weapons that were supposed to attack American industrial infrastructure spent their entire American deployment in the ground. The men who had carried them across the Atlantic in submarines had been too busy being back in America to remember why they had come. Here is what J. Edgar Hoover told the press on June 27, 1942. He stood before reporters and announced the capture of 8 Nazi saboteurs who had landed on American beaches with explosives and a plan to destroy industrial infrastructure. He described a vigilant FBI that had tracked the group from the moment of their arrival. He described the Bureau's intelligence capabilities, its surveillance network, its ability to identify and neutralize enemy operations even after they had reached American soil. He was confident and specific. The story he told was clean. The July 4th headline in the New York Times read, "Nazi saboteurs face stern army justice." The Bureau had protected the country. The enemy had been stopped. It was an Independence Day story. Almost nothing Hoover said was accurate. The FBI had not tracked anyone. It had not detected the landings through any intelligence operation. It had received a telephone call on June 14th from a man using the code name Pastorius, filed the call, and done nothing. Then it had received a second call from the same man sitting in a Washington hotel with a suitcase of money, asking someone to come pick him up. The Bureau's role in breaking the case had been to answer the phone, twice, and dispatch an agent to a hotel address. Hoover understood. with the clarity that defined his entire career, that this version of events could never be allowed to reach the public. He sent a memo to the White House requesting that the details of Dasch's cooperation be classified. Operational security, the memo said. The real reason was simpler. The story of Operation Pastorius, as Hoover had told it, required the FBI to be the protagonist. Dasch, being the protagonist, turned the Bureau into a supporting character, the people who answered the door when a conflicted man knocked on it. The classification was granted. The records were sealed. For years, the public version held, repeated in press accounts and government summaries and school textbooks, 8 Nazi agents, FBI vigilance, the American homeland protected. Some version of that story is still what most people know, if they know anything about this operation at all. Roosevelt's response to the arrests created a constitutional issue that moved faster than anyone expected. None of the 8 men had actually committed a crime under civilian law. They had brought explosives ashore. They had not detonated any of them. Under the Civilian Criminal Code, the charge would have been conspiracy, maximum sentence, a few years. Possible acquittal if a good defense lawyer argued the case well. Roosevelt found this intolerable. He wanted executions, and he wanted them to send a signal to Berlin. Send saboteurs to America, and they will die on American soil. On July 2nd, he issued Executive Proclamation 2561 and convened a military tribunal, the first on American soil since the Civil War. He told his Attorney General he would not permit any civilian writ of habeas corpus to interfere. The defense lawyers, Army officers assigned to the case, filed an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court, challenging the tribunal's constitutional authority. The court convened a special session on July 29th. Arguments were heard. The justices deliberated for 1 day. On July 31st, they ruled unanimously to uphold the tribunal. The written opinion explaining their reasoning came weeks later and was, by many legal assessments since, more cautious than the rushed decision it was meant to explain. But the ruling was clear enough. Enemy combatants who enter American territory during wartime with intent to sabotage can be tried by military commission. The tribunal proceeded. The outcome was never seriously in question. All 8 were found guilty. The tribunal recommended death for all 8. Roosevelt commuted 2 sentences. Dasch received 30 years, Berger received life imprisonment, in recognition of their cooperation with federal authorities. The remaining 6 were executed on the morning of August 8, 1942. Quirin, Heinck, Thiel, Curling, Haupt, Neubauer. 56 days after U-202 surfaced off Amagansett Beach. Speed was part of the message. Roosevelt had said so explicitly. The proceedings were secret. The press was not present at the execution. A brief official death notice. The men were buried in a potter's field outside the city. The Abwehr never again sent a sabotage team to the American mainland. What the Speed also prevented was scrutiny. A public civilian trial would have required the government to present evidence of actual crimes committed. These men hadn't committed any. They had brought explosives ashore and then spent 2 weeks visiting family. A skilled civilian defense lawyer had a real argument. A secret military tribunal followed by swift execution produced something the administration needed more than legal precision. A closed case and an unambiguous message. No acquittals, no inconvenient testimony, no public record of what the men had actually done during their 2 weeks in America, which was mostly nothing. Edward Curling had done everything right. He had planned the Florida landing himself, chosen the site, executed the insertion without incident. He had not encountered a Coast Guardsman in the fog. He had not aroused suspicion. He had followed procedure at every step. None of it helped him. He was in the electric chair on August 8th, the same as the others. Herbert Haupt, 22, American citizen who had gone home to his parents in Chicago and started planning a wedding, died at the same hour. His American citizenship, which Kappe had valued as an operational asset, was used as one of the arguments for his execution. He had committed treason against his own country. He was 22 years old. The woman he had been planning to marry was questioned by the FBI and then released. Dasch had believed, or had been allowed to believe, that his cooperation would result in a real pardon, that he would serve a nominal sentence while the Bureau used his information, then would be quietly released. Whether any FBI agent made that promise explicitly during the interrogation sessions is disputed. Dasch maintained until his death that the promise had been made and broken. The Bureau never confirmed it. What is certain is that he spent the next 6 years at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and that in 1948 President Truman granted both him and Berger executive clemency conditioned on deportation. They were put on a military transport and flown to Frankfurt. Dasch had believed he was going somewhere. He arrived somewhere else entirely. Germany did not receive him as a man who had done something complicated or difficult. It received him as a man who had betrayed an operation and sent 6 Germans to the electric chair. He was reviled. He had no professional contacts there, no support network. He was a stranger in the country of his birth in a way that he had never been a stranger in America, because America was where he had actually made a life. He applied to return to the United States. The application passed through normal channels, which meant it passed through J. Edgar Hoover's office. Hoover blocked it. He applied again and again. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, the answer was always the same. In 1959, Dasch published a book, 8 Spies Against America, in which he laid out his version of events in full, that he had planned from the beginning to surrender, that the FBI had not broken the case, but had received it, complete, from a man who walked in off the street with the money and the names, that the executions of 6 men were not the outcome of his betrayal, but the outcome of a government that needed executions more than it needed the truth about how the arrests were made. The book was published. It was read. It generated some attention. It changed nothing. Hoover was still directing the Bureau. The official version was still the official version. Berger's story ended less visibly. After arriving in Germany, he publicly broke with Dasch, blaming him for the collapse of the mission and presenting himself as someone who had been deceived rather than someone who had cooperated. Whether this was genuine anger or a strategy for surviving in a country that had no use for men connected to Nazi failures, nobody can know from the outside. He disappeared from public record within a few years of his deportation. The man who may have acted, under impossible circumstances, from something more principled than self-interest, who had been imprisoned by the very regime that then handed him explosives and sent him to America, simply vanished. No obituary, no death record, the absence where a person used to be. What strikes me about this operation, and I've read a lot of it, including the declassified FBI files, is how thoroughly it was designed to succeed and how completely it undermined itself before it ever got started. Every decision Kappe made was logical on its own terms. He selected men with American backgrounds because they could blend in. He funded them generously so they could operate for years without needing to contact Germany. He assigned them real targets that would have caused real damage if attacked. He built in kill protocols to prevent defection. On paper, an operation designed by someone who had thought carefully about the problem. What it didn't account for was that the men he had selected were not the men their files described. They were people who had once lived in America. And living somewhere is not the same as being from somewhere, but it is not nothing either. The classified records were eventually made available to researchers and historians. David Alan Johnson's 2004 book Betrayed, based in part on declassified FBI documents, laid out the gap between Hoover's account and the documentary record in systematic detail. Academic historians who examined the files reached the same conclusion independently. The Bureau had not tracked or found the saboteurs. The key break in the case had been a voluntary surrender from a conflicted man. This had been known to a small number of people inside the government since 1942. It became publicly available and properly documented 60 years later. By then, of course, all the principals were dead. Hoover's reputation had been substantially reassessed through other revelations, and the story had already been told the wrong way for so long that the correction barely registered. George Dasch died in Germany in 1992. He was 89 years old. He had spent 50 years trying to explain himself to a country that had officially decided it hadn't needed his help. He had tried to return to the United States for most of those decades. Hoover died in 1972, but the institutional answer to Dasch's applications did not change. The last request he submitted was denied, like all the others. He is buried in Germany. His memoir is out of print. The name most associated with Operation Pastorius in American memory, if the operation is remembered at all, is J. Edgar Hoover's, which is in its own way the most accurate summary of what happened after the executions. The legal ghost of ex parte Quirin, however, did not stay buried. In the weeks after September 11, 2001, as government lawyers were building the framework for trying suspected terrorists captured overseas, they went looking for precedent. They found the 1942 ruling. The Supreme Court had held that enemy combatants, including those with American citizenship or residency, could be tried by military commission without the protections of the civilian legal system. That ruling became the foundational document for the Guantanamo Bay military commissions. The procedures used to try men captured in Afghanistan in 2001 traced directly back to the tribunal Roosevelt convened in 72 days in the summer of 1942 for 8 men who never blew anything up. Legal scholars spent years arguing about whether that precedent had been applied correctly. The men in those proceedings had no say in the matter. It is worth noting, finally, what the German government said about Operation Pastorius, which is to say, almost nothing because there was nothing useful to say. The Abwehr had spent months selecting, training, and funding 8 men, had transported them across the Atlantic in 2 submarines, had provided them with enough money and equipment for 2 years of operations, and had produced 0 acts of sabotage, 14 days of freedom, and 6 executions. Admiral Canaris, who had predicted the failure before the men even boarded their submarines, was arrested by the SS in 1944 for separate reasons, was implicated in the July 20th plot to kill Hitler, and was executed in April 1945, 3 weeks before the war in Europe ended. He never commented publicly on Operation Pastorius. He didn't need to. John Cullen lived until 2011. He was 90 years old. He gave interviews over the decades about the night on the beach, the fog, the shape appearing in the dark, the man who pushed money into his hand and told him to forget. He described running back to the station. He described telling his superior what had happened. He described being told, years later, the full story of what he had stumbled into on that beach. He had been 21 years old, alone in the fog with a flashlight, and he had done exactly the right thing. He reported what he saw. He never claimed more than that. He received a promotion and a commendation after the arrests. He went back to his duties on the Long Island coast. He outlived almost everyone involved in the story by decades. There is a small marker at Amagansett Beach today. It notes the 1942 landing. It does not mention any of the men by name. The beach is a public park. People walk dogs on summer mornings along the water's edge. The spot where 4 men buried crates of explosives in the wet sand, where a 21-year-old Coast Guardsman with a flashlight met a middle-aged German in the fog, where a man chose not to give a signal and handed over $260 instead, that exact spot is unmarked. The Atlantic looks the same as it did in June 1942. The fog still comes in off the water on certain mornings. And somewhere in the archive, in a folder that spent decades classified and has since been released, the record of what actually happened is available to anyone who wants to read it. What Dasch did, what Hoover said, what the difference was, it's all there. It just never quite became the story that was told on July 4th, 1942. The story of a vigilant agency, a protected country, and a threat neutralized before it could begin. That story was easier. It just wasn't true.